Hello and welcome. In this activity, I'd like us to walk through several ways to access data within a database. We will start with some basic query by example activities in Access. We will then look at how to perform the same queries using SQL. Next, we will look at how to perform some simple SQL queries in a command line environment. Next, we'll use Oracle's client product, SQL Developer, to perform some SQL queries. First, let's look at Access. Let's look at the file Simple Pet Database. You can see that we have a table called Pet Data Simple Table. I like to put some kind of identifier such as TBL for table or QRY for query on my database objects. Most people don't do this, but in my experience, these three letters can prevent a lot of confusion. If I open that table up, I see some basic data. I have a unique identifier. This is my primary key. I have the pet species, the pet date of birth, the pet's name, the pet's date of death, and their last dental visit. And I can see this in Design View right here. Let's just run a simple query and pull all the pet names and species from the table. To do this, I can go to Query Design. I can choose the table that I want to pull data from. I choose the column names that I want, and there are several ways to choose your column names. Since right now I want to pull all the data, I can just choose the star. I can execute my query, and boom, I have the data. To see the query as SQL, you can just go to View and click SQL View. And the SQL really couldn't be simpler. Show me every column, every row, show me everything as a SQL statement. To go back to the Query by Example wizard, you can go back to View, go to Design View, and you're back to the wizard. To see the data, go back to View and go to Datasheet View. That's the data that was pulled, and it should be exactly the same as our table data because I said, tell me everything that's in the table. Let's do another example. Let's say that we want to do a query. So I'm going to specify my table. And let's say we just want to pull the names and species of every animal in the database. So I'm going to pull the name. And here's another way to do that. Just specifying which columns I want to pull. I'm going to run it. And there's our data. Here's the name and the species of every animal in the database. For every row, I pulled out just the name and the species. So Snooky is a Pomeranian and Cujo is a Maine Coon. If you want to see our query as SQL code, you can go to View, SQL View, and there you have it. This is the SQL. This SQL was written by the wizard in Access. So it's kind of convenient. Now let's pretend that I want to ask the question, what are the unique or distinct species listed in the database? To do this, I go to my Query by Example, I open the Query Builder, I select my table, and I select the column that I want the unique values for, which is pet species. I click into the Query Builder area, which is this area right here, and you'll see that when I do that, my property sheet was activated for the query. I come over and select Yes for unique values. Not unique records, for unique values. And when I run my query, I am shown only the unique values for the species names that are shown in my table. As you can see, there are actually several breeds within the species field. For example, Lab and Pomeranian are both breeds or types of the dog or canine species. This is an example of some dirty data that we would want to clean up if we were really going to use this data. We would want to, probably wouldn't want to use dog, we'd use canine, but we would get rid of Pomeranian and put in dog. For now, you get the idea and we'll roll with it. Once again, if you click on View and go to SQL View, you can see the SQL code written by the Access Query by Example functionality. Let's just experiment for a minute. I wonder if I can take the SQL code that was written by the query builder in Access and run it against an Oracle database. Would the SQL code work against Oracle? Let's take a look. What we're looking at here is a command line window using an application called PuTTY. You won't be working in PuTTY. You'll be working in an easier environment called SQL Developer. But you do want to pay attention because you will be writing SQL code shortly. I've uploaded the exact same data into Oracle, and I've used the exact same table name, which is pet data simple table. So in theory, I should be able to run the same SQL that worked in Access against my Oracle database and get the same results. Let's check it out. In the PuTTY interface, I entered the exact SQL that was created in Access, and my result is at the bottom of the captured screen. It works. I have 21 different species listed, and the content is the same. You will note that the order that the species names are listed in is different in Oracle than it is in Access. That's not insignificant, and if we wanted to get the same order, we could use an order by clause. What we're looking at is called a command line environment. In my opinion, this is a relatively painful environment, so let's look at an application that is designed to make it a lot easier to work with the database. Here you're seeing the Oracle SQL Developer application. As you can see, I have a list of tables on the left side and the column names for each table. I can also see lists of queries, triggers, views, etc. This environment has a lot of the user-friendly features that we might recognize from Access, and this is where we're going to be doing our work when we work with Oracle this semester. Let's just look at our table of interest, the pet data simple table. If we click on our table, we can see some very useful information about it, such as what data type is assigned to each column. You can see this information about the table in the command line interface in PuTTY, but you have to use commands or a script that you write, and unless you're very fluent in SQL, it's relatively cumbersome. As you can see, this functionality in SQL Developer looks a lot like the table definition area in Access, which is relatively easy to understand and use. Let's experiment a little bit. Let's see if we can take the SQL code that was written by the Query by Example functionality in Access and run that in the SQL Developer environment. All I've got to do is grab this code from Access and put that into SQL Developer, and I can run it. I click the green arrow to run my line of code, and my example will show up below. Keep in mind that although I have broken up my code for readability, this code is the same as this code. The only way that SQL recognizes the end of a statement is the semicolon at the end of the line of code. A line break does not tell SQL to quit running. So this is the same as this. Let's run a few examples. First, let's just count how many entries there are in the table. To do that, we'll run this code right here. And our result is the variable myCount and a count, which is 128. So there are 128 entries in our table. Next, let's look at all the entries for all animals listed as dogs. Again, our source data is dirty, so this search for dog won't pull Pomeranian or Lab. It will only pull rows where the pet species is specified as DOG. For this task, I'm just going to pull out the pet name and pet species, and I'm going to use a where clause to specify the dog species. Note that I'm using single quotes to specify the species. This code runs, and I get nice output. A list of all of the dogs, the species, which should be dog for each, and the name of each dog. Just quickly, I wanted to point out that although reserved words such as select and from are not case sensitive, you can go all lower, all upper, or a funky mix. Those words are not case sensitive, but when you are doing a search, this is going to be case sensitive. When I run a search for dog, lowercase, you'll see that I get no results because there is no entry for all lowercase dog. The only entries are for what I would call upper D, lower O, lower G, and there I do get some results. So I just wanted to point out that sometimes you don't have to be so careful, sometimes you have to be very careful. And again, I'm using single quotes to specify my text. The next thing that I can do is run a query to tell me how many species have dog listed as the species. Instead of showing all the dogs, I just want to get a count. To do this, I make a minor modification of my previous query, inserting a count, and off I go. I have 50 entries where the species is dog. You'll note that these 3 entries are the same. It is perfectly okay to put pet species in for my count. I can put star, which counts all my columns, but I'm still counting rows. And I can put pet name even though my subject of interest is the species. What I can't do is this. This is going to throw an error because the select pet name is trying to return 50 rows, while the count is trying to return only 1 row, and the results are not compatible. Let's briefly review. We've seen how to do a very simple query by example in Access, and we've seen how to see the SQL results of a query by example in Access. We've seen that the same SQL code that was written in Access also works when run against the same dataset in an Oracle database in both a command line and SQL Developer environment. Finally, we saw a few examples of some extremely simple SQL code being run against our pet database. Please let me know if you have any questions or comments. Thanks for watching.